Good afternoon and welcome to the 70th episode of Navigating Turbulent Times. My name is Sophie Hooper and I'm the head of policy at IWFM. And once again, I'm joined by an excellent panel and I will let them introduce themselves in a moment. First, I want to say a few words. More than 100 days have now passed since COP26, which was marked as a pivotal code red moment for our planet. Government action alone will not see us achieve the ambitions outlined. Profession and industry alike need to step forward to help make a difference across the sustainability agenda, and especially the net zero agenda, if we stand a chance at keeping temperatures at a sustainable level. Now, our introduction to this webinar talked about how the role of facilities management is changing, specifically against the backdrop of increased need for action from organizations on climate change. And we noted this need for action in the FM community and actually the need to bridge a gap between intent to action in our own sustainability survey that was published in September 2021. In our foreword to that survey, we called upon everyone to play their part and to outline how we ourselves as an institute need to play a role in supporting our members, which is why when the opportunity presented itself to support the Scope 3 work that the SFMI and BAM were coordinating, we took the opportunity to collaborate and support to work towards the standard for the profession to measure Scope 3 emissions. Now, at IWFM, our position on sustainability is that workplace and facilities management professionals are uniquely placed to make a difference to the sustainability agenda in its fullest sense, including net zero, because basically you are the linchpin in organizations, mirroring the needs of owners, occupiers, and the supply chain to create safe, healthy, productive, and happy workplaces. Understanding carbon measurement and taking greater responsibility for emissions, we see as a great opportunity for FMs, not just to increase the value of their role, but really to position themselves as part of the strategic engine in organizations to help achieve better business outcomes for the organizations they work for. And in this webinar, the SFMI will present an understanding of carbon in FM and how it is driving a key project to measure Scope 3 emissions in FM. Now, once the panel have introduced themselves, Chris will do a short presentation and then we will turn to questions from the audience. So please send in any questions you may have into our Q&A box, not the chat function, but the Q&A box. And if you want to remain anonymous, then please add Anon before your name. Chris, Reid, and Mike, thank you very much for joining us. May I please ask you to introduce yourselves?
Good afternoon, Chris Havers. I am the Programme Director of the Sustainable Facilities Management Index, which is a product of a consultancy, sustainability consultancy called Aclara Advisory. I work with FM providers and FM teams on how they can improve their their sustainability performance on an annual basis.
Hi everyone, I'm Reid Cunningham from BAM. I've been with BAM about 22 years, working in BAM FM and also the newer group company called BAM Energy. We have building a sustainable future objective in BAM, and we see the FM role in that as being enormous. So I look forward to the conversation about measurement of carbon.
Hi everyone, I'm Mike Lynch from NatWest Group. I'm the Climate Solutions Lead there. Here I guess to talk from, the buyer's perspective, client perspective. We've been tackling our carbon emissions for several years. Climate is one of the purposes of the bank to help support the transition to lower and ultimately zero carbon in the UK. So we have a big supply chain for our 1,000 properties that we occupy in the UK, and we have customers in this space. And the signatories to the Science Based Targets Initiative, we've an objective to reduce our Scope 3 emissions by 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And that's on the finance side and the supply side in terms of Scope 3. So getting better measurement and understanding of what we can do and the opportunities to reduce emissions is very important to us.
Thank you very much. Chris, can I invite you to please do your presentation?
Sure, thank you very much. So I'm going to spend just 10 minutes or so just giving you a bit of a background information on setting the foundations for net zero through the calculation of carbon emissions. And I'll do this through the lens of the SFMI. So I believe, yep, I've got control over the slides. So very quickly, the SFMI, for those of you who don't know, has the purpose of embedding sustainability into the management and operation of the FM sector. We, as Sophie mentioned at the beginning, we really see FM as that linchpin and that pivotal function, which can help drive not only environmental improvements such as the drive towards like zero carbon emissions, but also has a positive impact across a variety of environmental impacts and social issues as well. And it is able to do this because it as a function, FM is operating buildings, it's interacting with people within those buildings, it's also interacting with the community outside, it's managing research, refurb projects, it's purchasing lots of equipment, it has huge supply chains which it can draw in order to deliver services and provide products and which can be used in the building operations. So there's a huge chance to drive the increase in social mobility, social value, but then also reduce environmental impacts across the variety of different services that an FM can provide, from cleaning to catering to maintenance to energy management and security even, and many, many more. So we're focusing primarily on carbon management and what FM's role and the value of FM in this carbon measurement agenda. So I just wanted to give people a bit of an introduction into what carbon emissions are. Now I'm going to take a base of I guess a very foundation level base, just to give people a bit of background information to start off with, because we're going to be using some technical terms during the Q&A a little bit later. So when a company measures its carbon emissions, it will do so by creating this boundary, this operational boundary, in which it can collect its data from to understand what are the emissions emitting impacts of the company. And then it will categorize them into three forms. It'll either be scope 1 emissions, which is essentially your company's direct emissions, where it is burning fossil fuels on the facilities that the organization owns. So for this, if you have a building or you have vehicles that the company owns, then you will be burning natural gas within the buildings to heat them, or you'll be putting fuel inside the vehicles, turning on the ignition, in which case you're burning fuel in those facilities, because the vehicle is also a facility. So whenever you combust fossil fuels, that releases with carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, and that is a scope 1 emissions impact. Scope 2 is when you turn on the light within those facilities as well. You're using electricity which is generated by the power company. So technically they are accounting for that within their scope 1 emissions, but you are using it directly and you have control over whether you switch the light on and off, whether you plug the laptop into the wall or use any electrical appliance. So that is your scope 2 indirect emissions. And then outside of this, you have your scope 3 emissions, which is essentially everything else which can be categorized within 15 different categories within this scope 3 indirect genre. Now, this can be anything from the goods and services that you will go out and procure in order to deliver those FM services. So this could be the cleaning products, it could be the food from the catering hall, it can be the materials which are used in refurb projects, for example. All of these have to be procured and they have to be made elsewhere by another company. But the reason they're being made is because you're providing that demand for that product. And so that is part of your indirect emissions, because if you weren't there procuring that information, procuring that product, then it wouldn't exist. Then you have other things like that product has to get transported from the manufacturing site, whether it be in this country or over in the Far East. It still has to get here. That causes emissions. That will come under the transportation and distribution. And then you've got waste, which is generated from the operations as well. That's another product, because that waste goes in the bin or in the skip, and then that gets taken off to another facility over to the lands, the recycling centre or the land refuge, and that will slowly leak out methane within another site. So that's an indirect emission. And then you've got travel, business travel, commuting, all of these other things. It's all part of the emissions that are given off, which is causing climate change. So within FM in particular, there's a lot of goods and services procured. So I'm just highlighting key things which can crop up within the FM. And all of these things which are circling, they all cause an impact for the organization. However, often what happens is that these things often get forgotten about. And so we kind of relinquish responsibility because they're forgotten about. Whereas what we're here to talk about is actually the value of measuring this wider scope of emissions from the services that are being provided actually means that you become more responsible for them. And therefore, because you're working within organizations or for organizations who have a greater movement towards setting net zero carbon targets, and there's a huge drive externally in order to go to talk about net zero or climate neutral or carbon neutral, then being part of that discussion and accurately calculating and measuring these emissions will deliver greater value for the services that you're providing. So this is what we're here to be talking about, is how can FM upskill itself in order to be able to understand what the impacts of it are, and also create a standardized approach to doing this. So we're not all moving off in different directions and different angles, but it's done in a very consistent manner. There's also another context to this as well, because traditionally within the FM, within the building life cycle, the management and operational phase of that building life cycle is often forgotten about, because you have major carbon emissions related to construction, such as embodied carbon. There's a lot of talk in this building life cycle from embodied carbon, which tends to overtake the discussion about carbon emissions. And so FM has never consistently been measuring its impact of its scope 1, its scope 2, and its scope 3 emissions, which can then be fed into the building life cycle. And what the SFMI is keen to do is actually increase the influence of the FM function within that building life cycle, give it a greater, more consistent voice, so they actually can be engaged in the discussion about how buildings are operated, and then also it has a greater voice within that building life cycle. So this approach that we're going to be talking about today as well, this is going to be kind of helping to improve that reputation of the sector. So very quickly now, I guess I just wanted to give you a bit of an understanding of the levels at which organizations will often calculate their carbon emissions. So first of all, we have your easiest emissions to calculate. These are your scope 1 and 2. So for FM, often if it's an FM provider, for example, you'll have your head office facilities, and then you'll have a bunch of vehicles, fleet vehicles, where the organization will go off it because it's very mobile, moving off to other sites, because FM is often focused on lots of different sites from other organizations if they're a provider. So these are the easiest ones to capture, and these are the easy ones to measure, and they are regularly provided. They are regularly calculated, should we say. There are government requirements as well for this. So organizations have to calculate and report these if they're over a certain size. And that goes into what's known as streamlined carbon and energy reporting. Now, beyond this, it starts to get a little bit harder because then we start to venture into the scope 3. Now, there are no legal requirements in order to do that. And so it becomes very voluntary. So firstly, you have the travel and the waste, which becomes a little bit easier because companies can physically measure where they're traveling to, for example, because they have receipts of information. They know their business travel. And then you have the waste and generation. That is a little bit more difficult, but you can generally engage with your waste providers in order to capture this. Then it gets harder from there because then you've got the purchase goods and services. Now, this is your supply chain, and all of a sudden, this expands the difficulty and the accuracy of that information because we're looking at individual suppliers either calculating their emissions or we're looking at creating estimates of that data. And then from that point on, we've got how these emissions are then allocated to customers. For example, again, if you're an FM provider, you could actually be increasing the value of the FM services you're providing by providing them with a series of numbers to say, okay, these are the services that we're providing you. Could be cleaning, could be catering. And these are the emissions that we've calculated, which we can provide to you. And that goes onto your carbon inventory so that you know that we as a supplier are accurately adding value to your organization. And then because we know these emissions, we can actually set a zero carbon pathway for our organization so that you know that you're working with a company which is on a zero carbon pathway plan. So hopefully then what we're trying to do with this by engaging the FM sector in this is to really raise the importance of the value that an FM can provide by understanding emissions calculations, because it really does help you to engage with the rest of the organization or the clients, if depending on which side of the FM that you sit on, and it starts to build up that I guess intellectual property of the FM, and it starts to drive the importance, because then you can start to be much more strategic by aligning with the values of these organizations, which are really driven more and more as every year goes by towards how are they able to achieve carbon neutrality or zero carbon, because it's becoming a real driving point for organizations now. So very, very final slide now. What we're doing with what the SFMI and BAM are doing, coming together with a group of other organizations who are vetting the approach that we're taking, is to really build up a standard which allows organizations within the FM sector to say, okay, this is the boundary of our carbon emissions, and this is how we allocate emissions, whether we are working on site with other organizations, and this is how we can start to allocate these emissions and start to kind of communicate with them. So we're building up a report which we've released the first part of it already, which you can find on the SFMI's website. And we are currently working on how we can break down the different services that FM provides in order to then start to build up this boundary to say, here are the emissions that can be calculated according to the catering teams. Here are the emissions according to the maintenance teams. And then that provides, I guess, an instruction manual and guidance to allow organizations to follow, so that when it comes to engaging, everyone's working from the same hymn sheets. And then from this point on, we can then start to develop this project into kind of a much wider piece where we can actually start working from real data from the FM industry, and we can start to tackle the accuracy of data by using real information and real life data, which can then create much more accuracy for the FM industry to be working from, rather than I mentioned earlier about there being a lack of accurate information, because a lot of the time you're using theoretical kind of carbon calculations when looking at purchase goods and services as a key point. So we're really looking at driving the accuracy going forward by having a standardized approach. So that's me. Sophie, back to you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for that introduction. Right, it's time for questions, and we've already got questions coming in. Just quickly wanted to touch on kind of the situation that despite the huge potential for our profession to be a key agent of change in the area of sustainability, our 2021 sustainability survey showed that there are gaps in strategies, standards, roadmaps, data, and capability. On a positive note, net zero is the top priority area for 70% of respondents, and that's gone up with 12% against 2020 data. So I wanted to ask you, from your own experience, where do you see FM as an industry in the journey to measuring and managing carbon emissions? Do we have any takers for that question? Go on, Reid. You're on mute, Reid.
Sorry, the first to be on mute as well. Sorry, but yeah, champing at the bit to sort of say something about this. I think we can be very, as an industry, we can become quite self-critical. And I think actually what we need to see our kind of sensitivity about this, about whether we feel prepared. We need to see that against the context of actually the guidance, the definitions, where the whole world is at on this subject, and what's really interesting, and it might come as a surprise, is that the definitions and the boundaries of what is carbon neutral, what is net zero, what does it mean, are still evolving. And despite the Paris, Rio years ago, Paris, and then as Sophie mentioned, within sort of 100 days of Glasgow, the definitions and the boundaries and everything we're talking about has still been evolving. And one of the real gold standard organizations, the Science-Based Target Organization, has even been updating and republishing definitions and guidance in the latter part of last year, I think around the 20th of October. So this stuff is still moving and evolving. And I think it's very difficult for FM managers out there in the world doing their, busy doing their jobs every day, to keep an eye on where the global position is. And it wouldn't surprise me when Chris showed us that greenhouse gas protocol chart. And at the top, we've got carbon dioxide, and we all talk about carbon all the time. But many of those gases, those other greenhouse gases, aren't talked about a lot. Clearly, the refrigerants have their own registration and arrangements to minimize the risk of them being leaking and things. But it wouldn't surprise me if guidance continues to develop and the ambition of the sort of climate lobby continues to develop, and actually we might find ourselves doing more than just carbon. It won't be carbon neutral, it'll be carbon and PFC neutral or something like this. So we might find ourselves actually always a little bit behind the pointy end of where greenhouse gas control and measurement and minimization should be. Right now, just as a comment on this point, and right now, effectively, carbon is the focus, and effectively, if you can become carbon negative, that's being used as a way of offsetting those other non-carbon based greenhouse gases. So it is being kind of dealt with, but not directly. So my answer, I suppose, summarizing that a little bit, if it's helpful, get myself confused sometimes, is that I think we shouldn't be beating ourselves up that we're not quite sure what all this means, because actually nobody really knows what it all means. There's quite a wide variety of definitions and boundaries. So what I would say on this is that there's been a bit of a race of corporate organizations coming to make announcements about being net zero very quickly. And I think the goodwill is fabulous, you know, and the ambition is fabulous. But what those organizations really should have done is make up a sort of carbon inventory and work out, you know, what is scope 1, what is scope 2, how much data do we have, what is scope 3, and how much data do we have? Is scope 3 in our definition of net zero or not? And they would have been better informed as to whether 2030 is going to be possible, because depending on the definitions you pick, there's quite a wide variety of answers.
Thank you, Reid. I think what I'm hearing is really that actually, because of the variety and the journey that is still very much evolving, there is kind of a need to have a single language and a single standard to kind of work against, and then you can go on that journey together, but then at least everyone is playing on the same level playing field. Now, I think Mike, I'd like to bring you in because obviously, Reid, service provider perspective, you work in-house. How do you see that evolution, that journey taking place?
It's a good question. I guess it's quite comparable to our own journey, in the points to how good Chris's presentation was at the beginning, I guess, because scope 1 and 2 areas are, you know, relatively straightforward to measure, and generally speaking, there will be a good understanding of, you know, what you can materially tackle quite quickly, and quite often there'd be a more immediate or more obvious business case for finding some efficiencies in energy or reduced logistics and things like that. And as you move further away from scope 1 and 2 out into the outer rings of scope 3, understanding what's material and some of the kind of really granular detail of the services that are being provided to your organization through your supply chain become increasingly difficult. So I guess the way that we've approached this so far is basically set a pathway. So I said we had a target commitment. I think that is important, as Reid says, because having the ambition is the start point for engagement, and it drives the action. And then you almost need to work backwards from there to fill in the blanks. At the moment, we are modeling data based on spend by supplier category using CEDAR, a database. That helps us to understand where our most material carbon impacts are in theory. Our plan is then to engage those supplier categories or contracts directly where they're in the more material space, and work with them, partner with them to really get under the skin of so what does it actually mean for your business, and what does that actually mean for us? Because your carbon footprint as an organization could be very different depending on the services you're providing to different clients as well. And again, I recognize the complexity that comes when you're trying to divvy up almost a kind of carbon budget for your organization across your different clients. So it's, you know, I agree, all of the answers aren't there yet. I think a standard approach to or a roadmap for getting into the granular detail of where carbon exists in FM is really important. And I think, you know, collaborating, sharing ideas, working on best practice together is really, really important to do that.
Thank you very much. That really answered my question, actually, that I had. Where do you start? Ambitions, and you work backwards. That's really useful. Thank you. We've had some very interesting questions come in, so I'll try to kind of slot them. But one that really stands out, because it was going to be my next question, really, is if everyone is accounting for their carbon emissions, both directly and indirectly, don't we run the risk of getting an inflated figure from double accounting? Or I guess that was a translation for my question. If everyone does scope 1 and 2, then why do we do scope 3 type thing? Chris, I knew you were going to be on the ball.
Yeah, so this is I guess this is a classic question, and it's very relevant when you're looking at countrywide emissions. So when you're looking at country by country level data in order to calculate, you know, what is the UK's emissions versus what is China's emissions, for example. But when it comes down, what we're talking about is raising the value of FM for its customers and its as a service provider. And the way to raise value is by becoming more strategically important to the customers. And if customers are wanting to understand carbon emissions, then actually Scope 3 is an opportunity for FM to say, you know what, we will take responsibility for that and we will help you to get there. So actually, it doesn't, the topic of double counting doesn't really exist, because it's all about taking responsibility and saying, okay, we have a supply chain. They probably haven't been asked to calculate their carbon emissions because they're not large enough, for example. However, what we will be the authority to say, you're part of our supply chain, so therefore, can you go then about calculating your emissions? So then it actually means that the FM is becoming an influencer and it's taking more responsibility, and then it's creating more impact. So it's about kind of cascading that information, because classically the top of the pile when it comes to cascading demands down comes from the investment community, pension funds and such. They go to their assets under that they own that they own shares in, and they say, we need this information, can you collect it for us? They turn around and go, yeah, okay, because you own us. And then they then say, okay, we need more information from our supply chain, so we're going to go further back down the chain. Can you send your data through to us, because we need to send it? And it becomes this kind of waterfall cascading effect. And so this becomes FM's opportunity to be part of that, I guess, cascading effect, take responsibility, and then add further value in doing so, and actually then use this information in order to contribute and align with its customers' ambitions around climate change and mitigating risks, which they are being asked for in turn as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Reid, I do see that you've got your hand up, but I'm going to put Mike on the spot, because Chris, you talked a lot about how it's from service providers and how the drive is coming from investors there. But it's the same for FMs working in-house, I would imagine.
Exactly, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, the our goals mean that we have a responsibility to engage our service providers kind of proactively. So I guess I would describe Scope 3 as the best opportunity to engage and influence your stakeholders and what they do for you as a and over time, as things become the measurements and the information available becomes more detailed, those will start to influence investment decisions, to Chris's point, and purchasing decisions from the client side. And ultimately, it's I guess the race to zero that was put together in the road up to COP. I think last time I saw the website, there were 60 FTSE 100 organisations committed to net zero. The purchasing power of those organisations and their links into FM through the properties that they own and lease and so on is hugely significant. So I think from the investment and the client side, it's both big drivers on Scope 3.
Thank you, Reid. You've been very patient.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I was just going to add, because this is a bit of a classic kind of question, like Chris was saying, it's not uncommon, and I think an extension of it is sometimes to maybe slightly misunderstand Scope 3 as everybody else's Scope 1 and 2. So your Scope 3, sort of Mike's Scope 3 is maybe his Tier 1 FM contractor Scope 1 and 2. And their Scope 3 is their supply chain Scope 1 and 2. And it's not far from the truth. It doesn't quite capture everything, but it's not far from the truth. What's really interesting that is really different is we're all reporting through kind of government requirements to report carbon, at corporate group level. And what's really different about this is suddenly the whole supply chain, cascading right down, is being required to report to a customer at contract or address level or individual product level, and that's quite a big leap. It's not insurmountable, of course, but it is quite a big change, because instead of BAM corporately at group level in the UK just adding up all of our scope 1, 2, and we do report on some particular items in our scope 3 and pushing that out as our annual report, suddenly we've got to actually cut that up and tell every customer which bit of that carbon was theirs, if you see what I mean. And for an FM service, which is quite highly transactional or has that potential, then that can mean quite a lot of work, I think. Not impossible, but to divvy that up into individual invoices and activities and engineering visits, this kind of thing is quite an interesting challenge.
Sophie, I think as well, you're alluding to in-house FM teams, which, for a company where they are trying to achieve net zero and they have an in-house team and they don't procure FM services externally. Again, this is an opportunity for the FM team and the FM function to be providing more value within their organization, taking responsibility for it and saying, yes, we know where to get the data, we can provide this information, we can then provide the breakdowns, and we're creating extra value for our organization, which again goes down to extra responsibility and then leads to greater value for the function.
Thank you. I'd actually like to pick up on that, because I think I've already shared the IWFM position, saying that we think FMs are best placed to do this because they bring everyone together, all stakeholders together. But that's not necessarily something that is viewed within organizations as FM being best placed to take on that role. So why do you think, or what are the arguments FM should be using to make sure that they can make it clear why they are best positioned in that, Chris? I'm looking at you because it's kind of a continuation of the conversation, but.
So I think it's, connectivity is a huge part of it. Understanding how the organization operates with that kind of wealth of knowledge, which is the operational level understanding, being able to connect within the organization and being able to pull lots of information together from across the business and then interpret that information, analyze it, provide it then to the teams who are potentially kind of taking on that. I guess large organizations will traditionally have a sustainability team, and often they will take the lead on these things. But then, more and more we're looking at how sustainability should be embedded within an organization, and less reliant on, I guess, an individual, siloed individual within the team. And they should actually be connecting across an organization. And that FM function does have that ability to be kind of hyper connected within the organization. And then if they're able to make meaningful outputs and interpretations on that data, then they can help provide strategic decisions for investments in the future and such, which I guess traditionally we may not have seen before.
Thank you for that. I saw lots of nodding even now. Does anyone want to add something to this?
I was only going to add, maybe we've also got an opportunity to have a very active or leading role, because in any of the sort of decarbonisation plans, it tends to be scope 1 and 2 that are going to be prioritised first, because like we've already said, there is some, there may be the most achievable, when Chris had his sort of easy to difficult chart that he showed us, the scope 1 and 2, in terms of gathering data and making good economic decisions about what you're going to do, is often quite high on the sort of inventory and early actions list. And it's a kind of familiar area for the FM sector. So I'm kind of thinking, as FM professionals and as an FM industry, we might find ourselves being able to get some traction in our organization by saying, hey, we're the flag bearers, we're delivering scope 1 and 2 benefits, let's keep going. And we can be the glue that holds together the procurement department, the HR department, all these other departments that are contributors into the scope 3 piece. That's kind of an idea, and it will suit some organizations, it might not suit them all.
Mike?
Yeah, I guess I agree with both of the points made. I think the FM's ability to engage stakeholders across hierarchies and organizations and in the supply chain is pretty unique. I mean, the FM often talk to people on the board on occasion and people that work on the front line, customer facing roles. So they've got a unique kind of range of stakeholders, but also, I guess, got unique influence opportunities. So I think if an FM provider, in-house or supplier, was to draw a stakeholder map and the different levers and material places where there's a carbon impact in a service, whether it be in the client's scope 1 and 2 or their own scope 1, 2 or 3, it become pretty clear pretty quickly how material FM's the opportunities and the risks are of not acting on that. And I think at that point you need to be really clear, or try to make it as clear as possible. Okay, so who's responsible for delivering against that change? And I think more often than not, if you look in a lot of the categories I'm thinking of, FM would have an important role in delivering or facilitating some of those changes to decarbonise effectively. Yeah.
That's great. So taking all that on board to really kind of take away some of the existing barriers to achieve the ambition of that unique role and that kind of pivotal role, what would be your top tip to our members to get there?
I think from my point of view, aligning on ambition, so being absolutely sure that everyone has a shared objective. Then it's about what's the most material action that needs to be taken to realise that ambition. And then, as I said, I think it's about then making sure the responsibilities for delivering against making reductions in those material spaces are made as clear as possible. And then, it's about actually getting on and delivering and measuring progress against those objectives. But that's my view. Chris, I think you were going to say something as well.
No, I agree with that. I mean, communicating what's been done as well is going to be vital as well to increase that influence and that value that's been delivered. Yeah, I'd add the communication part at the end of it onto what Mike's saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in my experience, what's really interesting, and I think we all agree, scope 1 and 2 are on the easy side of the scale. What's really interesting is, my experience is there's still inadequate. What's the tool? We all have the tools. The tools exist and they've been around for a few years to get half-hour data and things. There's often still a lack of data to be able to prioritize, like Mike was saying there, where you're going to get the best effect soonest, easiest, most economically, and let's start making progress at that. I'm still seeing sometimes when I ask people for energy data, I get 12 monthly bills handed to me, and we can do as an industry so much better than that at a very, very low cost. In terms of data, very, very low cost, using AMR and half-hour meters and things. And the insight that can give you to make really good decisions is phenomenal. So one of my points would be, let's do the easy stuff that we can do. Let's get that out of the way, and then we can work on the challenging stuff. And I think the other piece for me, I get the communication. You're absolutely right. Communicating inside the organization, being clear about what we're trying to achieve. But I think the supply chain, we need to put an arm around them really quickly and help the supply chain who maybe haven't engaged an enormous amount yet. They hear the wider press, but maybe they're not always being asked those questions that are cascading, like Mike said, from those 60 huge customers into the tier 1 organizations. Are the tier 2 organizations being asked the same challenging question? Because it can't be shouldered just by tier 1 contractors. It will find its way right throughout the supply chain into products being manufactured and everything.
Thank you, Reid. I want to pick up on the communication bit and something that was said earlier around language. There's also some questions around data that I think I will kind of slot into this section. So language is very important, and there seems to be confusing messages around the language that is being used. What's the difference between net zero, carbon neutral? Can we talk a little bit about that, please? And kind of understand why that's important, because I guess it goes back to outlining the ambitions to then actually being able to go on the journey. Who would like to go first?
Reid, you like this one, don't you?
I thought he was being very patient.
Well, yeah. So, and I maybe raised this at the point a little bit, and I'd love to say I had an answer, but what we're seeing, I suppose, is quite loose use of these sound bites. So people are talking about carbon neutral. And carbon neutral is primarily focused on scope 1 and 2 emissions, with a kind of voluntary idea that you might start looking at scope 3. And in that respect, it's quite attainable, achievable. People are setting sort of 2030 type of targets. Then you're thinking, well, okay, with scope 1 and 2 and with a plan, then kind of an offset roadmap, you might call it, which is kind of what Mike was talking about, but doing some projects that take you in the right direction. Then, that kind of terminology, that kind of plan is quite good. Now, sometimes that then gets called a net zero carbon plan. You think, well, okay, that's interesting. And then, at the other extreme, you've got these science-based targets published in October, which are a real gold standard. And what they're requiring a short-term plan to about 2030, a sort of 8 to 10 year plan to 2030, and they require certain targets to be achieved by 2030, but they then have a long-term plan, so if to 2050. And if your organization, or if organizations want to make a big statement about 2030, then they probably should concentrate on the sort of carbon neutral messaging, because the science-based targets are kind of saying it's just no one's going to get there for 2030 on their definition and what they are suggesting is required, because they are including scope 3 and a very wide definition. And it's extremely ambitious, and it's very, very good to have a gold standard. And I think maybe Mike was talking about 2030 and a 2050 standard. Maybe Mike can talk a bit more about that from an organization point of view. And in fact, BAM have signed up to science-based targets. But I think we're still kind of working on that long-term roadmap. It's very exacting. So the answer is a bad answer. There's two extremes. But there's also stuff in the middle, and I think it will get clearer and clearer.
Thank you, Mike. Did you want to add anything to that?
So I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think it's very useful now that the Science-Based Targets Initiative have set out their stall. As Reid said, there's been quite a few iterations, so it's useful to have a kind of overall banner and direction of travel for what's effectively the whole organisation. So you've got, as I said, the kind of own operations categories that are more 1, 2, and limited 3, and then your supply chain and customer base as well. That's a lot to digest in one meal, in one sitting. So I think the approach that we took on our own operations, and some of our scope 3 was to set a net zero objective and climate positive for 2020, and we achieved climate positive for a very specific and defined scope of our emissions. And I think the key really here is, if you have a net zero or climate positive or carbon negative, any of these terms, you just have to be extremely transparent and open and clear about exactly what that means in practice. So where are you drawing the boundaries of what's being measured? Where are you realizing the reductions? And I think very importantly, you can't be seen to remove carbon from the atmosphere through carbon credits or neutralize carbon through emissions avoidance credits at the expense of carbon reduction in your own operations or in your scope 3. The priority has to be to begin to reduce, and you compensate or remove the carbon further down in the journey. So, for example, our 2020 net zero ambition, which we realised in 2020, that we only took the decision to do that because we'd already reduced our carbon emissions in that defined category by 60% in the 6-year period beforehand. And we're continuing to target to reduce those emissions going forward. So it's not becoming complacent once you've achieved that goal. It's continuing to reduce aggressively in line with the science. But I think there is an argument for, provided you are ambitious enough in your reduction plan and you are delivering against that, it is reasonable, and I think there's an argument for being a leadership position to also compensate for what you haven't been able to achieve yet by investing in what I would describe as a high integrity carbon removal credit. And just to call out the fact, the difference between carbon removal and an emissions avoidance credit, that's going to affect what you're able to claim. Is it net zero because you're removing the carbon, or is it emissions avoidance and carbon neutrality? It's another consideration in your approach. Indeed.
Now we've got loads of questions coming in. And actually one that really closes to round up this part of the discussion is, as experts, do you believe that net zero emissions by 2050 is realistic? Because we talked about 2030, not going to happen, but 2050 net zero emissions.
Good question. So that requires, net zero on is it a net zero for a business or global, or?
I don't have that information. Sorry, that wasn't.
We're getting into technical boundaries. I think, so basically, I guess if you are a UK business and you have a net zero 2050 target, there will be an element of reliance on the national grid decarbonising to get there, because you're using energy from that national grid. Then there is the heating of your facilities and the electrification of vehicles and such, which will have that. And then, so that, heating at the moment is causing a bit of a difficulty, but one would hope that that would be solved for 2050. Then when you get into your scope 3 emissions, then we start looking at travel purposes, kind of flights and things like that. I don't know how the airline industry are doing on their decarbonisation journey, but there's no site for carbon zero travel at the moment. And then you've got kind of agriculture and things. If you have supply chain working within kind of food stocks and things like that, that's very difficult. But yeah, and it depends how optimistic one is feeling on any given day. Sometimes you hear great stories of amazing technologies and things which will revolutionize the world, and other days less so. I think it's very I guess we are at that point where serious action needs to happen, and happen fast, in order to achieve that 2050 targets.
Great. I'm going to quickly take a few questions because it's already 1:55. And I'm going to take the question of how will emissions data be collected? And there's been a lot of discussion around science-based targets. What were the targets based on before? I think if we can take that kind of together, then that might be useful. Reid, you're nodding.
Yeah, okay. So I think there's pure measurement, scope 1 and 2 we can kind of measure. There's some really interesting stuff as well going on about you can sort of measure those kilowatt hours of energy, but we tend to be using Ofgem published conversion factors to work out what that means in terms of CO2. And Chris probably knows what I'm about to say, but actually that isn't fixed. And over the last few years, what we've seen is a steady improvement in the intensity of carbon in our gas a little bit, but certainly in our electricity supply, our grid electricity, it's probably got twice as good as it was a few years ago. There's some all 100% green energy supplies you can use, not necessarily always sometimes they're frowned on a little bit by the carbon purists, but they are there and they are genuinely contributing to the market for renewable generation, which is a good thing. What else is interesting, and this isn't widely known, is that regionally, there's data that indicates the actual carbon intensity at any moment regionally in the UK. And if it's windy and there's been some rain, then Scotland tends to have a very low carbon intensity because its wind turbines and its hydro schemes are working overtime, whereas parts of the Midlands in England can have quite a poor simultaneous poor carbon intensity. Now, so if we all gave up on the Ofgem standard annual published carbon intensity averages and we used our actuals, then everybody could just relocate to the Highlands of Scotland and they would hardly be burning any carbon at all, which is interesting. And I'm probably using up valuable time and getting distracted on that one, but I couldn't help it. I think, so this about, how do we calculate it? Where's this stuff coming from? It's a mixture. I think it's going to be a mixture. It is already a mixture of either actual measured stuff with some carbon intensity factors or simply applying a kind of rule of thumb across the industry. One of the things that maybe Chris didn't say out loud was that the idea of this tool is that we can have some consistency in how we're measuring stuff. So if we've got engineers in transit vans visiting multiple customer sites, let's at least establish some consistency about how we're measuring that. It might be possible to measure the type of vehicle, the type of miles, and be quite accurate. But whether he drives at 60 or 50 and gets caught in roadworks halfway along the way, that amount of information on the actual carbon emission might just be too much to ask, I don't know if that really answers the question. I'm just starting to blather now.
I'd say in terms of the carbon emissions targets used to basically be based on a company looking at its emissions and thinking, oh, we could probably make a 5% reduction next year and a 3% reduction next year and such. So it's really just a bit of a finger in the air based on how much investment one was willing to put into it. But now all of a sudden we've got this whole reliance to prevent dangerous climate change, and we're ultimately saying that sector Y has got a carbon budget to burn because we know how much carbon in the world is needed to be burnt in order to keep global warming below a 1.5 degree warming level, or a 2 degree level, or a 3 degree level. And so now essentially, rather than companies being asked to say put a bit of a reduction in place and whatever's best, we're actually saying actually what you thought was best originally is no longer applicable because the world only has a certain amount of carbon to burn before we reach dangerous climate change levels. And so it's really enforcing science-based targets are really enforcing carbon targets based on this scientific knowledge of how much carbon in the world is available to burn before reaching dangerous levels of climate change over a certain period of time.
Thank you. I've noticed that it's already 1 p.m. There's many questions that we haven't answered quite yet, so I think we might need to do a repeat at some point. What I was just wondering on is if each and every one of you, if there's anything that you want to add right now to the conversation. Perhaps, Chris, I can pick on you to go first if there's anything you wanted to say, kind of round up of your thoughts to the discussion.
Yeah, I saw a thing in a one in there about asking, whether FM should be encouraging their organisation to sign up to science-based targets. I mean, ultimately, yes, is a great idea, because I think FM taking that initiative, understanding what carbon emissions are within the organisation, and then trying to be I think Reid used the term, flag bearer, to get their organisation to be acting more responsibly is a very positive image that FM can show for itself and will help kind of drive its value, especially if you can see the business drivers for your organisation, which will help it. So business drivers could be new business for new tenders, because the customers of the company are probably requesting carbon reduction plans, etc.
Great. Reid?
I think if there was a sort of takeaway point, I would think, whilst we all maybe accept and we're all disappointed in some respect that there isn't a clearer roadmap for us all to follow, I think it is clear that whichever boundary you want to use, we have to get started. So I would say the big message for me is think about a sort of carbon inventory. So you can start to say, where am I emitting the most carbon, and what am I going to do about it, or what can my organization do about it? And maybe the scope 1 and 2 is an easy place to measure and start. And there might be components of scope 3 that you think, well, actually, some of these are attainable, but get started, because none of it will be wasted. And one way or the other, it will fit in with what emerging plan or statement your corporation eventually wants to make. It'll be worthwhile.
Thank you. Mike, parting shots?
I guess I would sort of stress the importance of partnerships and collaboration in this space. I think any effort to try and standardize the measurement and the approach is very helpful, but also in terms of delivery. It's impossible to be an expert in all of these spaces as a standalone business. Working with your customer base, your supply chain, local authorities, there's no shortage of organizations that are trying to bring people together to solve some of these problems. And I think the SFMI and the fact that we're having this conversation is a good sign, because it helps to bring people together and share those ideas. So collaborate and partner, speak to everyone and anyone that will listen to move things forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, Reid and Mike. It was an absolute pleasure. And thank you to the audience as well for joining us and bearing with us, even though I'm slightly overrunning. Apologies for that. It's clear that the Scope 3 project is quite important to bring an idea of where we need to move to as a profession and industry. If anyone is interested in contributing to the work that the SFMI is doing, please get in touch, either through me at policy@iwfm.org.uk or with Chris Havers direct. And as a parting shot, I would like to encourage people to participate in our Market Outlook survey, which closes on Friday. In-house service providers, we want to hear from you both, because it helps us to prioritize our policy for the future, our policy and insight for the future. Thank you very much for today. Until soon, bye.